The day of the Lord. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5 mention the day of the Lord, just as 2 Peter chapter 3 does. But if you take notice, 2 Peter chapter 3 says, on the day of the Lord, heaven and earth will be destroyed, which means that 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5, the day of the Lord, either must be a different day of the Lord than in 2 Peter chapter 3, or it must be the same day of the Lord, and therefore Zechariah chapter 14 cannot be a reference to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5. It is my goal to show to you and prove to you from Zechariah chapter 14 itself that Zechariah chapter 14 is not about Jesus coming. Rather, Zechariah 14 is an Old Testament principle that teaches that God would save the faithful of his people while destroying the wicked. And at the time that he destroyed the wicked through the nations, he would afterward punish those nations. So that way it's a picture of universal proselytization under the Old Testament. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 1 mentions the day of the Lord. Zechariah chapter 14 verse 2 mentions that this day of the Lord would be a gathering of all nations to fight against Jerusalem. And it says, the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So this is not a reference to 70 AD. This is not a reference to something in our future, and we're going to show that. But Zechariah chapter 14 verse 3 says, this day of the Lord is not a day against Jerusalem. This day of the Lord is actually a day against the nations. The day of the Lord is a picture of the Lord fighting. And in Zechariah chapter 14 verse 3, we see that the Lord is fighting not against Israel, but against the nations that fought against Israel. And after God is pictured as done fighting with these nations, verse 16 says, it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of tabernacles. So this shows us two things. This shows a picture of universal proselytization under the Old Testament. And number two, it shows the Old Testament still in effect. Even verse 20 and verse 21 prove that the Old Testament was still in effect, because verse 20 mentions the pot in the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. And so the Lord's house is a reference to the temple. And since 70 AD, there has not been a temple in Jerusalem, and there's no promise in the scriptures that there will ever be another temple in Jerusalem. And verse 21 also mentions the temple in Jerusalem, where it says, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts. Everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them. In that day there shall no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. That's a reference to the temple under the Old Testament. And so what we see is that this day of the Lord in Zechariah 14 is not a reference to the same day of the Lord as 2 Peter chapter 3. And it's not a same reference to the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5. Otherwise, one would hold to the belief that the Old Testament, which was nailed to the cross, is going to somehow be brought back into effect. It took the death of the Savior in order to bring about the New Testament. So who's going to die in order to bring back the Old Testament?